Sometimes the room that laughs at you the loudest is the same room that will be forced to stand when your name is finally spoken. The academy briefing room smelled like floor wax, fresh coffee, and the kind of tension that always hangs in the air on the first day of recruit orientation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold shine across rows of metal chairs where 32 recruits sat in crisp Navy uniforms, back straight, eyes forward, each one trying to look fearless even as their polished boots gave away the nerves they were trying to hide. On the far wall, beneath the department crest, a framed slogan read integrity before authority, but in that room, those words felt more decorative than real. At exactly 8:03 a.m., the side door opened, and a black man stepped inside wearing a plain charcoal suit. No badge visible, no entourage, no need to announce himself. He moved with the quiet control of someone who did not have to prove he belonged, and that was the first thing Officer Ryan Mercer noticed. Mercer was already at the front of the room, sleeves pressed, jaw tight, posture sharpened for performance. He liked an audience, especially one full of fresh recruits who hadn't yet learned the difference between command and ego. The second he saw the man in the doorway, his expression shifted into something thin and amused. He looked him over once, slow and deliberate, then turned slightly so the recruits could enjoy the moment with him. "You lost, sir?" Mercer asked, his voice carrying just enough sarcasm to stir a few uneasy smiles. The man stopped near the back wall, calm as still water. "I'm here for the orientation," he said. His voice was low, steady, and unbothered, which only seemed to irritate Mercer more. "Orientation," Mercer repeated, letting the word hang in the room like a private joke. "For staff, check the admin wing. For visitors, the lobby is downstairs. For everyone else, there's a chain of command." A few recruits glanced at one another, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. One did, softly. Another looked down at his notebook. But the man in the charcoal suit never flinched. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply stood there, one hand resting at his side, eyes sweeping the room with a kind of measured silence that felt strangely heavier than Mercer's voice. That silence should have ended it. Instead, Mercer stepped away from the podium and walked closer, feeding off the discomfort in the room like it was part of the lesson. "You can stand in the back until somebody figures out where you belong," he said. Wouldn't want the recruits getting confused on day one. This time the laughter came a little louder, though not from everyone. Near the front row, one recruit shifted in his seat, brow furrowing. Near the podium, Sergeant Dana Brooks looked up from a folder she had been reviewing and fixed her eyes on the man at the back with a look too sharp to miss. On the center table beside her sat a closed binder, a silver pen, and a black nameplate turned face down. The man's gaze drifted to it for the briefest second before returning to Mercer. "Is that where you want me?" he asked. Mercer smirked, thinking he had won something. "That's exactly where I want you." What Mercer did not see, what the recruits had not yet understood, was that the room had already begun to shift. Because some men walk in looking like strangers, and some men walk in so certain of themselves that they do not need the room to know who they are yet. Not until the right moment. Not until the lesson is ready to begin. Marcus Ellison did not move to the back right away. Not because he was refusing the order, and not because he needed to make a scene, but because there was something in the room worth measuring first. The recruits. Their faces were young, disciplined on the surface, uncertain underneath. Some stared straight ahead, as if looking away could save them from being part of what was unfolding. Others watched him with open curiosity, trying to place him, trying to understand why a man being spoken to like that looked less rattled than the officer doing the talking. Marcus had seen rooms like this before. Rooms where people learned the rules long before they learned the truth. Rooms where confidence was often confused with character, and volume was mistaken for leadership. He took 2 quiet steps toward the back wall, exactly where Mercer had pointed, and folded his hands in front of him. No complaint, no visible irritation, just control. That seemed to satisfy Mercer for all of 3 seconds. He turned back toward the podium with the swagger of a man pleased with his own performance and planted both palms on the table like he was about to deliver something historic. "Lesson 1, he said, pacing slowly in front of the recruits. "This profession is about order. I do not care who you are, where you came from, or what story you tell yourself when you look in the mirror. In this building, respect is earned." His voice sharpened on that last line, angled just enough toward Marcus to make the point land where he wanted it. A few recruits nodded automatically, though one in the second row, a tall kid with a shaved head and a stiff posture, looked unsettled by the whole thing. Marcus noticed everything. The shifting eyes, the forced smiles, the woman in the third row pressing her lips together like she wanted to say something and knew better. Sergeant Dana Brooks remained near the front table, one hand resting lightly on the closed binder, her face unreadable. But every so often, she glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:05, then 8:06. Like timing mattered. Mercer kept going, building himself bigger with every sentence. He talked about discipline, command presence, professional standards. He talked about the badge as if it were a kind of inheritance instead of a responsibility. He threw out phrases the recruits would remember because they sounded hard, not because they were wise. People will test you, he said. People will walk in here thinking they deserve a seat at the table. Your job is to remind them that not everybody does. This time, he did not even bother to hide where the remark was aimed. The room tightened. Marcus remained still, but inside, a memory flickered. 20 years in uniformed service had taught him that humiliation often says more about the speaker than the target. He had worked narcotics in neighborhoods Mercer would never last a week in. He had led community response after nights when the city felt one bad decision away from breaking apart. He had spent years carrying calm into rooms full of fear, anger, politics, and grief. And standing there now, being treated like an inconvenience in front of 32 recruits, he felt no need to defend himself. Tom would do that for him. At 8:07, the back door opened again. A deputy chief stepped in, followed by two command staff officers in full dress uniform. The sound of chairs straightening rippled through the room. Mercer froze for half a beat, then straightened his shoulders and smiled like he had been expecting them all along. But Dana Brooks did not look at them. She looked at Marcus. Then, with deliberate care, she lifted the black nameplate from the table, turned it upright, and placed it at the center of the podium where everyone in the room could finally read the silver letters reflecting under the harsh fluorescent light. For one suspended second, no one in the room breathed. The polished black plate sat beneath the academy lights, simple and unmistakable, and the silver lettering cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice ever could. Commander Marcus Ellison, Director of Recruit Training. The words seemed to pull the air out of the room. Recruits who had been sitting rigid now shifted in stunned silence. One stared at the podium, then back at Marcus, then down at his own hands like he needed a place to put his shock. Another straightened so fast his chair gave a sharp scrape against the floor. Near the front row, the young woman who had pressed her lips together earlier closed her eyes for half a second, as if the truth had landed exactly where she feared it would. Officer Ryan Mercer did not move at first. His face held that strange blankness people wear when their confidence has not yet caught up to reality. The smirk vanished. The posture remained, but the meaning behind it had collapsed. His eyes went to the nameplate, then to Sergeant Dana Brooks, then finally to Marcus, standing exactly where Mercer had told him to stand, calm and composed, as if the moment belonged to time itself and Marcus had merely agreed to wait for it. Brooks stepped to the side of the podium and spoke with the kind of clear, level authority that did not need force behind it. Recruits, commanding staff, this is Commander Marcus Ellison. Effective today, he assumes leadership of the entire Recruit Development Division, including curriculum standards, field readiness, conduct review, and instructor oversight. The last two words landed like a bell in an empty church. Instructor oversight. Several recruits looked immediately toward Mercer. That was when the color left his face. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for the room to feel it. Marcus finally moved from the back wall, each step measured, unhurried, his dress shoes tapping a steady rhythm across the polished floor. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant either. If anything, he looked exactly the way he had looked when he first entered the room, which somehow made everything worse for the man who had tried to shrink him in front of an audience. Marcus reached the podium and rested one hand beside the nameplate. He did not touch it. He did not need to. The deputy chief, standing near the door, gave him a respectful nod. So did the two command staff officers behind him. Small gestures, quiet ones, but to the recruits, they said more than any announcement could have. Ryan Mercer opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, perhaps simply to reclaim a sliver of control, but no sound came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the edge it wore so comfortably minutes earlier. "Commander, I did not realize." Marcus lifted one hand slightly. Not rude, not theatrical, just enough to stop the sentence before it could turn into something hollow. "That much is clear," he said. His tone was even, almost gentle, and that gentleness cut deeper than humiliation ever could. No one laughed now. No one shifted. The room had become intensely still, the way rooms do when people realize they are witnessing the moment a mask falls off in public. Marcus let the silence stay for a beat longer. He looked across the rows of recruits, not just at their faces, but through the nervous energy behind them, through the uncertainty, through the lesson they had just received, whether anyone meant to teach it or not. He knew what they had seen: a man with authority using embarrassment as a tool, a room hesitating instead of thinking, a leader being judged before he ever spoke his name. And now they were about to see something else. Marcus placed both hands lightly on the podium, glanced once at the slogan on the wall, "Integrity before authority," and then looked back at the room with a steadiness that made every recruit sit up straighter than before. When he began to speak, his voice did not rise. It did not have to. It carried because it was grounded, because it had lived through enough to know the difference between performance and power. And in that room, for the first time all morning, leadership actually sounded like leadership. Marcus let the silence settle before he spoke again, not as a man savoring anyone else's discomfort, but as a leader making sure every eye in that room was fully open. "What happened here in the last 10 minutes, he said, his voice steady and unhurried, "was not just awkward. It was not just unprofessional. It was instructional. The problem is, it taught the wrong lesson." No one moved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere near the back of the room an air vent clicked softly as it kicked on, the only sound daring to interrupt him. Marcus swept his gaze across the recruits one row at a time, and the effect was immediate. These were young men and women who had arrived thinking they were there to learn policy, procedure, and posture. Instead, they had just watched the moral center of the profession get tested before the first notebook had even been opened. "Some of you," Marcus continued, "just saw what happens when a person mistakes position for character. Some of you saw how easy it is for a room to stay quiet when somebody is being publicly diminished. And some of you are probably asking yourselves whether this is the kind of culture you just signed up to serve in." The words landed hard because they were true, and truth has a way of making even the most disciplined room feel exposed. Marcus rested one hand against the podium and turned slightly toward the wall where the framed slogan hung under the department crest. "Integrity before authority." He looked at it for a moment, then back at the room. "That statement is not decoration," he said. "It is not there to impress visitors or make reports look good. It is supposed to mean something when nobody important is watching. It is supposed to mean something before names are known, before titles are announced, before you learn whether the person in front of you can affect your career." Several recruits lowered their eyes. One swallowed hard. Another sat even straighter, as if posture could make up for the shame of having witnessed something and done nothing. Marcus did not blame them for being young. He did not blame them for being uncertain. But he was making sure uncertainty would not become their permanent excuse. He turned his head just enough for Ryan Mercer to know he had not been forgotten, but Marcus refused to center him more than necessary. That alone shifted the balance of the moment. Ryan had tried to make himself the author of the room. Marcus was making him a footnote in a larger lesson. "Leadership," Marcus said, "does not begin when people salute you. It begins when you are given a chance to embarrass someone and choose dignity instead. It begins when your authority is tested by uncertainty and your first instinct is not ego, but discipline. It begins when you understand that respect cannot be demanded from a weaker position you create for somebody else." Near the doorway, the deputy chief folded his hands behind his back and gave the faintest nod. Sergeant Dana Brooks remained still, but there was something quieter now in her expression, almost like relief. She had seen enough rooms go wrong to know how rare it was for someone to correct one without raising his voice. Marcus looked out over the recruits again, and this time something in the room had changed. The fear was still there. So was the embarrassment. But now there was a tension of a different kind, sharper and more honest. "You will all wear a uniform," he said. "You will all carry responsibilities that civilians trust you to handle with fairness, restraint, and judgment. But hear me clearly. The badge does not make you impressive. The title does not make you honorable. And the room will always tell on you before your record does. His eyes paused on the second row, then the third, then the back wall where he himself had been told to stand only minutes earlier. This academy is not going to teach you how to look powerful, he said. It is going to teach you how to deserve power. And if that sounds heavier than what you expected when you walked through these doors this morning, then good. It should. The room stayed quiet after Marcus finished, but it was no longer the silence of spectators. It was the silence of people thinking harder than they had expected to think on a Monday morning. The recruits sat with their shoulders squared and their eyes forward, yet the energy had changed in a way that was impossible to miss. They had entered the academy wanting instruction. What they had received instead was a mirror. Marcus let that settle for another moment before opening the binder Sergeant Dana Brooks had placed beside the podium. Inside were orientation schedules, ethics standards, field evaluation procedures, and the training philosophy he had spent the past 3 months rebuilding line by line. He glanced down only briefly, then looked back up. "You are here to learn law," he said. "But law without judgment is just force-wearing paperwork. And judgment without integrity is how departments lose the trust they spend decades trying to earn back." A few recruits reached for their pens. Others looked at him with the kind of attention that comes when somebody has moved from authority on paper to authority in spirit. Marcus noticed them all. He noticed the young man in the second row who had laughed earlier and now could not seem to lift his eyes above the edge of his notebook. He noticed the woman near the aisle who had looked uncomfortable from the beginning and was now listening with visible relief, as if she had been waiting for someone to say out loud what she had feared this profession might forget. He noticed the tall recruit with the shaved head, the one whose expression had tightened when Mercer first made a show of the doorway, and he saw in that recruit the first sign that this class might still become what it was meant to be. Near the front, Ryan Mercer remained standing off to the side, a man in full uniform suddenly unsure what to do with his own hands. He had positioned himself that morning like part of the architecture, solid and unquestioned. Now he looked like a person hearing every past version of himself all at once and finding none of them useful. Marcus did not humiliate him further. That was not mercy exactly. It was structure. There was a difference. This academy, Marcus continued, turning one page in the binder, is changing effective today. Every recruit will be evaluated not only on tactical readiness and written performance, but on discretion, restraint, situational fairness, and respect under uncertainty. That last one matters more than most of you realize. Because on the street, uncertainty is where character finally tells the truth. The deputy chief shifted his weight slightly by the door, listening with his chin lowered. Dana Brooks stepped back from the podium and folded her arms, not closed off, just observant. She had watched commanders come in loud before. Marcus had done something harder. He had taken control of the room without needing to take up more space in it. "You will be tested," Marcus said. "Not just by suspects, not just by stress, and not just by long shifts. You will be tested by assumptions. Your own, your partners, the department's, the public's. Sometimes the person in front of you will look exactly like the story somebody warned you about. And if that is enough for you to stop seeing them clearly, then you are not ready for this badge." Those words landed with the kind of weight that did not fade after they were spoken. In the third row, one recruit slowly set down her pen as if she knew she would remember that sentence without writing it. Another leaned back, just slightly, blinking toward the crest on the wall with a new expression on his face, one that looked less like ambition and more like responsibility. Marcus closed the binder softly. "This morning was not how I planned to introduce myself," he said, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of weariness in his voice. Not weakness, but history. But maybe it was useful, because now I know what kind of room I have walked into. And more importantly, now this room knows what kind of academy it is about to become. He paused, letting his gaze travel once more across the recruits, then to Dana Brooks, then briefly to the command staff near the door. Finally, his eyes settled on Ryan Mercer for one measured second before returning to the class. "Open your notebooks," Marcus said. "The first lesson starts now. And this time, we will do it right." The sound of notebook covers flipping open moved through the room in a soft wave, one after another, until even that small noise seemed to fall into line. Marcus Ellison stood behind the podium with the binder closed now, his hands resting lightly on either side of it, and watched the recruits adjust to a new reality. 10 minutes earlier, the room had been arranged around performance. Now it was arranged around attention. The change was subtle, but Marcus had spent too many years reading rooms under pressure not to recognize it. He knew when people were pretending to listen. He knew when they were waiting for their turn to impress. And he knew when something had pierced through the posture and reached the part of a person that might actually learn. "Write this down," he said. "The first mistake most officers make is believing that the job begins when something goes wrong. It does not. The job begins long before that. It begins with what you notice, what you assume, what you ignore, and what kind of story you tell yourself before a single word is spoken." Pens moved quickly now. Even the recruits who had looked stunned a few minutes earlier were writing with focus, trying to catch every word before it passed. Marcus stepped away from the podium and walked slowly across the front of the room, his voice calm, each sentence precise. "Every encounter starts before contact," he said. "It starts in your posture, in your tone, in the way you decide who belongs and who does not. By the time you speak, you have already introduced yourself. The question is whether you introduce judgment or professionalism." That line hung in the room. Marcus saw it land. A recruit near the back frowned slightly. As he wrote it down, as if the sentence had unsettled something he thought he understood. Another paused, pen in midair, staring ahead with the distant look of someone replaying the last half hour in his head. Dana Brooks noticed it too. She remained near the wall now, arms folded, quiet and still, but the sharpness in her expression had softened into something more hopeful. This was what the academy was supposed to sound like. Not slogans, not theater, not manufactured toughness passed off as discipline. Real instruction, the kind that forced people to examine themselves before they ever touched the authority they wanted so badly to carry. Marcus stopped in front of the first row and turned back toward the class. "Some of you came here because you want purpose," he said. "Some of you came here because your family has worn this uniform for generations. Some of you came here because you think this badge means stability, respect, or a way to matter. I understand all of that. But if your need to feel important becomes stronger than your duty to be fair, this profession will turn you into something dangerous long before anyone writes a complaint." No one shifted now. No one looked at the clock. Even the command staff by the door remained silent, letting Marcus own the room in the simplest way possible by speaking truth that did not need embellishment. Ryan Mercer stood several feet off to the side, his expression fixed, his shoulders tight, listening to a lesson that had become impossible not to hear. Marcus did not glance his way. He did not have to. The room itself had already placed Mercer where he belonged for the moment, not erased, not excused, but reduced to the evidence of what happens when authority outruns character. "Here is the standard," Marcus said. "When a person walks into your space, you do not decide their worth by their clothes, by their tone, by whether they make you comfortable, or by whether they fit some picture in your head of who belongs. You gather facts. You regulate your ego. You stay professional until professionalism gives you a lawful reason to do otherwise. That is what separates a disciplined officer from a reckless one." The fluorescent lights cast pale bars across the academy crest as Marcus returned to the front center of the room. Outside, somewhere beyond the narrow windows, a siren rose and faded in the distance. A reminder that the city was already awake and waiting for every one of these recruits to become something useful or something harmful. Marcus looked at them one by one, not as a group now, but as individuals. "You are all being trained for moments that will move fast," he said. "But the decisions that define you are often made in the first 2 seconds, in silence, before anybody else knows what you are thinking. That is why this academy is going to teach you how to control what happens before the report, before the arrest, before the explanation, before the regret. Because if you cannot govern yourself in a room like this, you have no business governing anything out there." The room remained locked on Marcus Ellison, but something quieter was happening beneath the surface now, something more dangerous to old habits than outrage ever could have been. Reflection. It moved across the rows of recruits in different ways. In some, it looked like embarrassment. In others, it looked like awakening. Marcus could see both, and he understood the difference. Embarrassment fades if a person is only worried about being seen. Awakening stays if a person is willing to be changed. He walked slowly down the center aisle between the rows, not pacing for effect, not using movement like performance, but closing the distance the way a real instructor does when he wants the lesson to stop feeling abstract. "You have probably been told," he said, "that this job is about command presence. You have probably heard that phrase enough times already to think it means looking tough, sounding certain, and making quick decisions under pressure. But command presence without moral restraint is just intimidation dressed in policy. And intimidation can control a room for a minute. It cannot build trust for a career." Several recruits stopped writing and simply listened. The young man in the second row who had laughed when Mercer made his first cutting remark now looked as if he wished he could erase the last 20 minutes from memory. Marcus saw him, but did not call him out. Shame could teach something when handled carefully. Humiliation usually taught the wrong lesson. Near the third row, the woman by the aisle held her pen still above the page, eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of concentration that said she had come here, hoping the job could still mean something honorable. In the back corner, another recruit who had seemed almost eager when Mercer first started posturing now looked smaller somehow, not physically, but morally, as if he had just realized how easily a crowd can become complicit without ever saying a word. Marcus stopped near the middle of the aisle and turned to face them fully. "There will be days when nobody thanks you for your restraint," he said. "There will be moments when ego offers you a shortcut and professionalism asks more of you. In those moments, the public will not see your internal struggle. Your partner may not even understand it, but your choice will still matter. It will matter to the person standing in front of you. It will matter to the people watching. And eventually, it will matter to the kind of officer you become when the uniform is no longer new and the job starts revealing what you were carrying all along." By the wall, Sergeant Dana Brooks lowered her arms and let her hands rest at her sides. Even the deputy chief, a man not known for visible emotion, watched Marcus with the careful stillness of someone hearing the exact message the academy had needed for years. Ryan Mercer remained where he was, rigid, silent, no longer the center of anything. The room had moved beyond him now, and that was its own kind of judgment. Marcus turned back toward the front, then paused when he reached the first row. His eyes lifted to the crest on the wall, then to the recruits again. "Some people think corruption begins with money," he said. "Sometimes it does. But just as often, it begins somewhere smaller and more socially acceptable. It begins with contempt, with assumptions, with the quiet belief that certain people deserve less patience, less dignity, less benefit of the doubt. Once that belief settles into a person, the rest becomes easier than anyone wants to admit." That sentence stayed in the air like a warning. A recruit near the back drew in a breath and let it out slowly. Another shifted in his seat, not out of boredom, but because truth can make a chair feel hard. Marcus returned to the podium, but he did not stand behind it right away. He rested one hand on its edge and looked over the room as if weighing each face against the future. "You are not here just to learn how to enforce rules," he said. "You are here to learn how not to become ruled by the worst thing inside you. Fear, pride, bias, impatience, the need to dominate. If you cannot identify those things in yourself, the street will identify them for you, and by then it may be too late to undo the damage." No one looked away now. The academy slogan on the wall no longer felt like decoration. Under Marcus's voice, it began to sound almost like an accusation toward every year that had come before him. He finally stepped behind the podium again and opened the binder to the next page. "This class was supposed to begin with orientation," he said. "Instead, it began with exposure. That is fine. Exposure can be useful. It shows us where the weak points are. It shows us what this academy has tolerated. And it shows me exactly how seriously I need to take what happens next." He let that settle, then lifted his eyes once more, calm and unwavering. "Because what happens next is not just training. What happens next is whether this department keeps reproducing the same failures with fresher faces, or whether some of you are finally ready to become better than what you have inherited." Marcus let the last sentence linger in the room until it felt less like instruction and more like a line no one could step back across. Then he closed the binder with quiet precision and looked toward the deputy chief near the door. No signal had been given out loud, but some moments do not need ceremony. The deputy chief stepped forward just enough to be seen by the recruits, his polished shoes catching the sterile light of the academy floor, and in a voice stripped of decoration he said, "Effective immediately. All instructional assignments are under review. Commander Ellison will determine who remains in training leadership and who does not." There was no gasp, no dramatic reaction, only the kind of silence that spreads when consequences stop being theoretical. Ryan Mercer did not slump or protest. He stood exactly where he had been standing, but the room no longer responded to his uniform the way it had 20 minutes earlier. Something had been taken from him, not by public humiliation, but by exposure. The recruits saw it. Dana Brooks saw it. Marcus saw it too, and that was why he did not add a single unnecessary word. He had no interest in turning correction into spectacle. Spectacle was what had caused the problem in the first place. Instead, he stepped from behind the podium and faced the class one more time. This is what accountability looks like when it is not delayed, softened, or hidden behind rank, he said. It does not require shouting. It does not require theater. It requires clarity. A profession either corrects itself in the light, or it rots in the dark while pretending to stand for standards. Pins were no longer moving now. The recruits were simply listening, their earlier nerves replaced by something heavier and more useful. They were watching a department decide, in real time, what kind of behavior it would excuse and what kind it would no longer protect. The young man in the second row lifted his head fully for the first time since the reveal, his expression sober now, stripped of the cheap amusement that had flickered across his face earlier. The woman by the aisle sat with both hands folded over her notebook, eyes steady on Marcus, as if this moment had answered a question she had not known how to ask when she walked into the building. Marcus turned slightly and looked at Ryan Mercer, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the firm steadiness of a man refusing to let another human being hide from what he had chosen. "Officer Mercer," he said, and his voice stayed level. "There are recruits in this room who will remember what they saw this morning for the rest of their careers. The issue is not only what you said. The issue is what you modeled. You showed them how quickly authority can become disrespect when it is rooted in assumption. You showed them how easy it is to diminish someone before facts are gathered. And you showed them how a room can be led in the wrong direction by a person who mistakes confidence for principle." Mercer swallowed once, a small movement, but in that room it sounded louder than a confession. Marcus did not press further. He did not need to. Some lessons are complete the moment the truth is finally named. He turned back to the class. "You will hear people say that policing is about control," he said. "That is only partly true. It is also about restraint, about perception, about whether you can enter a tense moment without becoming the most dangerous thing in it. The public does not need officers who can dominate a room. The public needs officers who can steady one." Outside the narrow academy windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, washing pale gold across the edges of the blinds. Dust drifted through the light in thin, almost invisible lines, and for the first time since Marcus had entered the room, the academy felt less like a stage and more like a place where something honest might finally begin. Dana Brooks moved toward the side table and gathered a stack of printed orientation packets, her motions efficient, her face unreadable but no longer guarded. The deputy chief returned to his place near the wall, leaving the room fully in Marcus's hands. That, more than any title, told the truth. Marcus placed one hand on the podium and let his gaze travel across the class from left to right, not missing a single face. "You came here to learn how to wear the badge," he said. "I am here to teach you something harder. How not to disgrace it when nobody thinks your behavior will cost you anything. Because that is the real test. Not what you do when command staff is present. Not what you say when cameras are rolling. What you do when you think the person in front of you is too unknown, too powerless, or too alone to matter." The room sat motionless beneath his words. Ryan Mercer lowered his eyes. The recruits did not. And in that single difference, Marcus could already see the first sign that the morning had not been wasted. "Class," he said softly, and somehow that softness carried more authority than anything Mercer had said all day. "Turn to page 1. We are going to begin with constitutional contact, professional presence, and the discipline of withholding judgment. Because if this academy is going to mean anything after today, then the next generation in this room will have to learn what the last one should have known before they ever stepped through that door." Page 1 turned in near unison, a soft chorus of paper moving under fluorescent light, And for the first time that morning the room sounded like a class instead of a test. Marcus Ellison stood at the front without rushing, letting the recruits settle into the weight of what had already happened. The academy briefing room looked the same as it had an hour earlier, the same rows of chairs, the same crest on the wall, the same slogan framed in official lettering, but nothing inside it was the same now. A room can keep its furniture and still lose its old illusions. Marcus knew that better than most. He had spent too many years walking into institutions that praised discipline in public while quietly rewarding something uglier in practice. He had seen good officers pushed to the margins, bad habits passed down like tradition, and entire cultures built on the hope that no one brave enough would ever step in and say this is not what leadership looks like. Now he looked across the rows of recruits and saw something he had not seen when he first entered. Not perfection, not certainty, something better. Attention with conscience behind it. Before this morning, he said, his voice measured and clear. Some of you probably thought policing was mainly about presence, command, and procedure. Those things matter, but they are not the core. The core is whether a citizen, a witness, a suspect, a victim, or a fellow officer can stand in front of you and still be treated like a human being while you figure out what the facts actually are. No one wrote that down right away. They just listened. Marcus let them. Some sentences are meant to be heard before they are copied. The young man in the second row who had laughed earlier now held his pen still, his face set with the kind of seriousness that only comes when a person realizes he almost learned the wrong lesson from the wrong man. The woman by the aisle gave a small nod to herself, almost invisible, as if something inside her had settled into place. Dana Brooks stood by the side table with the orientation packets stacked neatly beside her, watching the room with quiet approval. Even the deputy chief, still near the wall, kept his hands behind his back and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Marcus turned one page in the binder and continued. You cannot build public trust with performance. You cannot restore dignity with paperwork after you have already stripped it away in the first 30 seconds of contact. And you cannot claim professionalism if your judgment changes depending on who you think a person is, what they look like, or how much power you think they have. The truth of that sat heavy in the room, but not hopelessly. There was something cleaner in the silence now. Less fear. More clarity. Ryan Mercer remained off to the side, still, quiet, no longer leading anything. And in that stillness there was a lesson too. Not a lesson about punishment alone, but about exposure. About what happens when the room finally sees the difference between authority and worth. Marcus did not look at him again. He did not need the final word over one man. He wanted the final word to belong to the standard itself. He stepped away from the podium one last time and stood in front of the first row, close enough now that the recruits could feel the steadiness in him rather than just hear it. Most people will never remember the exact statute you cited, he said. They may not remember the paperwork, the sequence, or the language of your report, but they will remember how you made them feel when you had power over the moment and they did not. They will remember whether you entered that moment with discipline or ego. They will remember whether you saw them clearly or just saw your own assumptions reflected back at you. A slow stillness moved across the room, and Marcus let it happen. Outside, the city kept moving. Calls would come in. Sirens would rise and disappear. Lives would intersect with uniforms in ways none of these recruits could yet predict. But inside this room, something had already been decided. Not perfectly, not permanently, but decisively enough to matter. Marcus returned to the podium and placed both hands on either side of the binder. This academy will not be remembered for how loudly it talks about honor, he said. It will be remembered for whether the people trained here can carry honor into rooms where nobody expects it, into moments where nobody rewards it, and into decisions where it would be easier to act smaller than the badge demands. His gaze moved across every row, every face, every future that still had a chance to become something decent. When he spoke again, the words were quiet, but they carried all the way to the back wall where he had first been told to stand. Some men wear a uniform and think it gives them the right to define others. The best officers learn the harder truth. The badge does not reveal who matters. It reveals who you are when someone else does.